right, so our topic for the main room for this session is Cacao 101. And I'll just go with an overview. So we're going to be talking about a couple different things, starting out with cacao ecology, then talking about contraindications, particularly around working with cacao in ceremony, drink preparation, some recipes and tips on making your drink, the health benefits of cacao, discussion of raw cacao, and then a discussion on cacao varieties. So a little bit more of an overview, not necessarily specific to doing ceremony, but some of it will move in that direction. And I'll leave some time at the end for questions. So if you've got questions as we go, just write them down, remember them, and then we'll open it up at the end for some discussion. All right, so to start off with, cacao, Theobroma cacao, the tree, the plant, grows in what's known as the 2020 zone. The 2020 zone is roughly 20 degrees north and south of the equator. That region has the conditions necessary for cacao production. It's hot, it has high humidity, and it gets high annual rainfall. The current known origins of cacao are in South America, and it eventually moved to Central America. As we know, a lot of cultures there have a long history with cacao, and pretty much everywhere in that 2020 zone, cacao now grows. It grows about 90% of production is in West Africa. Southeast Asia grows cacao. And even when you get a little bit outside of that 2020 zone, it still grows, but when conditions are less optimal, it doesn't grow as ideally. So Theobroma cacao, Latin name for the plant, which translates as food of the gods. Cacao is an understory plant in the rainforest. So if you imagine an overstory rainforest, cacao would be an understory plant, which means it loves shade. It's a shade-loving plant, especially early on. So a lot of cacao nurseries, you'll see shade structures covering the seedlings as they grow. As it gets older, it can tolerate more sun. One of the things I love about cacao, part of what makes it relatively unique, and just because I love the word, cacao is known as a cauliforous plant. And as you can see in the picture, what this means is that both the flowers and the fruit grow right off the trunk of the plant. So those flowers in the picture will eventually turn into the fruit. And cacao is pollinated by an insect known as a midge. Midges live in the leaf litter in the forest floor. Again, if you think about its natural habitat would have been wild rainforest, lots of deep leaf litter. Midges thrive there and they pollinate. So on cacao growing farms these days, they need to make sure that there's a healthy ecosystem in place to ensure that pollination happens. So cacao starts with a seed. So on the tree, those flowers that we just saw will turn into pods. They look kind of like Nerf football. They come in many different colors, pinks, oranges, yellows. And inside of that, there's about 30 to 50 seeds and a sweet tart pulp or fruit. The fruit is in and of itself a food source, but when we're processing it further to make chocolate, cacao, etc., the fruit is an essential part of the fermentation process. In its truly raw form, as in straight off of the tree, cacao seeds taste very bitter. They don't really taste a whole lot like chocolate, and they contain anti-nutrients like phytic acid and tannins. And so it's the transformation that'll occur after it's harvested that starts to develop the flavor that we would recognize as chocolate. So the first step in that transformation is fermentation. So when the cacao pods are ripe, they'll be gathered in a central location. And the reason they need a central location is because they need enough volume, enough mass of cacao to make the fermentation work properly. So this often happens in wooden boxes or a covered location. And fermentation is an underappreciated aspect of cacao in that it's a real both art and science to get it done properly. So they're managing the moisture content in the fermentation batch, the heat and ambient temperatures of the climate, the sugar content of the fruit. So the fruit is all thrown in there into the fermentation pile, and different varieties of cacao have different fermentation times. So when fermentation is done well, either at the farm or smaller cooperatives or smaller farms will do that collectively at a location. They develop protocols for their own particular variety or genetics. For example, they might do a 48-hour, then rotate, 48-hour, rotate, and then a final 24-hour. So it's going to depend on all those variables. And for high quality cacao beans, like what we use in ceremony, what craft chocolate world uses, the goal is about 80 to 90% fermented. So the picture here is what's called a cut test, and they cut the beans and they're sampling to see how well fermented the cacao is. And so this is really the first step in the enzymatic and chemical transformation of cacao. The phytic acids are starting to be removed at this point, and the flavor is starting to change. The color will also darken. After fermentation is complete, it needs to be dried out. So often, because we're in tropical locations, this can just be done in direct sunlight on a concrete pad or up on wooden tables. And the goal with this step is to reduce the moisture content, because after this is usually when it gets shipped to a chocolate shop or around the world for various further processing. Both fermentation and sun drying temperatures usually get into the 120, 125 degree temperature range. If you think about a regular compost pile, if it's done properly and you put your hand in the middle, it's really hot. So already it's gotten above what would be considered raw temperatures at this stage. So from there you have the what would be called cocoa beans, and in terms of how we consume cacao in ceremony, what the chocolate industry would call cocoa paste, or what we call pure cacao, there's a couple different steps. The first is the roasting. So the cacao bean has a skin on it, kind of like an almond skin, and the cacao gets roasted. And after it's roasted, it'll be winnowed, which is removing that skin. And then it gets ground, and the grinding puts it through so that it comes out almost like a liquid fudge consistency, and then it can be shaped, and as it cools, it hardens into, in our case, there's a picture of our cacao bars. And just to take a step back here, some terminology, because there's often some confusion in the world of chocolate and cacao about what all these different terms mean, the difference between them. So what I just described, the chocolate industry would call cocoa paste, which is 100% pure cacao. You have the nib. So in this picture there, you can see there's a little bit of cacao beans and the nibs next to it. Essentially, cocoa paste is the same as nibs. It's just ground up in a way where it can be cooled into a block form or reformed. If you were to then separate out the cacao butter from what would be called cocoa solids, you would get the cacao butter. In that picture, it's the yellow white chunks there, and then you would get cocoa powder. So most of what we know in the hot chocolate world or are familiar with is cocoa powder. So that's defatted cacao. So they've separated out the cacao butter, which tends to be about 50% by weight on cacao. So about half of that is gone. Generally, cocoa powder is also further processed using chemical agents to change the pH level. And then with chocolate, they're often recombining various ingredients, cacao butter, cocoa powder, in various proportions to give us what we know of as chocolate. And there's a little confusion also because some companies are now using the cacao spelling, C-A-C-A-O, when they're referencing powder. If you looked at the nutritional profile, you can see the fat content is still pretty low, maybe in the 10 to 15% range instead of 50% plus. In the chocolate industry, generally cacao, CACAO, is only used to refer to the tree. For us, it's a reference to it in its pure form, or that there's nothing added or removed. So contraindications, and this is particularly important when we talk about doing cacao ceremony, which essentially is high quality cacao in a larger dose. So to start with some general expectations, for us, we think of cacao as a plant medicine, and that means having respect for it and being mindful in how we use it, in treating it like a relationship that we need to tend to. So cacao is considered a bitter and a stimulant. For that reason, some people might experience nausea, headache, or sweaty palms. In most cases, just drinking water and it'll pass. Cacao is also mildly laxative and can potentially stimulate detox. This is more true if you were, say, fasting for a little while or the body needed it. The detox is relatively uncommon, but it's a possibility. And then usually I like to share, there's a couple specific concerns in which we would either go lower dose or recommend people not consume cacao. And those are, the first one is for pregnant or breastfeeding women. Because of the stimulating properties of cacao, we would just go lower dose. So much like pregnant or breastfeeding women wouldn't have much coffee, it's the same thing with cacao. Number two is that there are certain antidepressants that are contraindicated with cacao. There's two different categories here. The first is antidepressants that are MAOI based. These are considered first generation antidepressants. They're not very common anymore, and most people who are on these are on a restricted diet to begin with. That would include limited to no chocolate. So this should be pretty self-evident. I believe it's the tryptophan in cacao is contraindicated with those type of antidepressants. The second type is the SSRI antidepressants, which are more common. Those are the serotonin-based antidepressants. And the concern that people have here, you might come across this if you search it online, is that because cacao contains both serotonin and precursors to serotonin, it might stimulate something called serotonin syndrome, which is essentially an overload because the antidepressants are doing that. There's no direct research that links the two. People on SSRI meds are not on a reduced chocolate diet. And what we're talking about is essentially dark chocolate in a higher dose. So usually we just tell people to check in with their doctor or whoever prescribed it to see their opinion on a higher dose. And lastly, people with serious heart conditions, like something like a pacemaker. Cacao is a vasodilator, which means it'll increase blood flow significantly, and it's important to check in if people have a heart condition. In 11 or 12 years of working with cacao, I've never had what I would call an emergency with cacao. I would not classify it as a psychedelic, so it's a plant that I find is very safe to use, and having a little bit of awareness and respect for it can really mitigate any potential negative effects. So as we're getting to talking about the drink, the first question is on dosage, on how much cacao to consume. So the first thing I want to say about that is that dosage is really unique to the individual. In all the years that I've worked with people in ceremony and training people to share it, I've seen a really wide range of possibilities here. I know people who a quarter ounce, half ounce of cacao is, more is the limit for them. Other people who can have more than 2 ounces and they're fine. So the first thing I want to say is I really recommend that people experiment themselves and get familiar with their own body and the dose that feels good for you. So our general guidelines for that is that these are by weight. 1 ounce of cacao is what we would consider a daily dose. So a morning energizer or a drink in the afternoon. You're going to feel the effects of it, but it's not going to be too strong. And then when we do ceremony, generally we serve 2 ounces of cacao. We'll talk about how that mixes with water in a moment. but again, 2 ounces by weight. And that's what I would consider the maximum dose. People who are new to cacao, we usually serve that as 2/3 of it first. We wait 30 to 45 minutes and see how people are feeling. And then if they want more, they can have it. So to make the drink, if I was doing, say, a daily dose, I would do around 5 ounces or a cupful of water, 1 ounce of cacao. If I was doing it for ceremony, like today, I would do 7 ounces of water and 2 ounces of cacao. Those ratios of water to cacao, there's nothing magical about that. Really, it all has to do with just the consistency of the drink that you'll get. So more water, thinner drink, less water, thicker drink. In my experience, it's not going to affect the experience that you have with cacao. It's more just preference. Sometimes when we're serving a really large group, we don't want to be dealing with huge volumes of water. So it's nice to go a little lower. And to that, you're going to add any sweetener to taste. Often at home, we use honey, maple syrup, generally alternative sweeteners, but in my experience, sugar or other sweeteners are fine also. We recommend cayenne because it helps the body assimilate cacao a little more quickly. And then any other spices, cinnamon, vanilla, a lot of people, especially on the daily drink, will go with other superfoods to it. Cacao generally pairs well with a lot of different things. So what you're going to do is you're going to heat water to just before a boil, either in a pot or in your mug, add all the ingredients, and then whisk and enjoy. It's pretty straightforward. The main thing you want to be mindful of is not boiling the cacao for a while, because that tends to separate out the cacao butter from the rest of it. Not a big deal if it happens. In my experience, it doesn't affect the experience that you're going to have. It's just less enjoyable to consume. And in terms of other, people sometimes ask about adding things like coconut milk or nut milks or cow milk. You know, a lot of us grew up drinking hot chocolate with milk. And for ceremony, we always just go straight water. I find the body tends to absorb it more quickly that way. If I'm making some kind of daily drink at home, then I'll use coconut milk, other nut milks, just to make it more decadent. The two that we don't recommend are cow's milk and soy milk. There are some compounds in them that tend to block the absorption of the flavonoids in cacao. Health benefits. Cacao is considered one of the more complex plants out there, and it's almost like the more we learn about it, the more we realize we don't know much about it. So this is kind of a current snapshot of things that we know about cacao and its health benefits. And since the craze of dark chocolate and the health benefits was kicked off, there's just a lot more research coming out every year about the different compounds in cacao and the things they do for us. So this is a short snapshot of that. So the first one, as a lot of us know, cacao is high in antioxidants such as flavonols and polyphenols. Cacao contains theobromine. So theobromine is considered a bitter alkaloid, which means it's a sister molecule or in the same family as caffeine. But a lot of people experience it as more gentle or grounded. It focuses more on increasing blood flow in the heart, whereas caffeine is more of a nervous system stimulant. And generally, there's about 5 to 10 times more theobromine than there is caffeine in cacao. It's considered the main psychoactive component in cacao. Cacao also contains a bunch of different mood enhancers, which are also known as neurotransmitters, serotonin, PEA, and anandamide, all of which are in the class of feel-good compounds. And it's got high levels of magnesium, which is both a muscle relaxant and an important mineral in our diet. And as I mentioned earlier, pure cacao is about 50% cacao butter, which in and of itself is a source of really healthy fats. There's lots of great stuff in the cacao butter, and having it in there when we're drinking it helps the body absorb all the nutrients from the rest of cacao. And in our case, our cacao is tested for heavy metals, just to make sure that they're all at safe levels. Raw cacao. So over the years, this is definitely something I see come up a lot. And sometimes I think there's a confusion that people have between using the word raw and pure. And I think sometimes when the word raw is used, what people intend to say is pure cacao, as in it's just the cacao beans, as in cocoa paste that we're consuming. Other times, they actually are talking about raw as it relates to a specific temperature. It's an important topic because it relates to how we at Heartblood process our cacao and how cacao has actually been processed for hundreds of years traditionally, which is that it includes roasting. So the fermentation, the sun drying, the roasting all serve important purposes. They help reduce the level of anti-nutrients in cacao that are not good for our body. Anyone that lives near an oak tree who's eaten a raw acorn might know what tannic acid or tannins taste like. It's super bitter, not good for the body. So those three are important processes. Fermentation and sun drying on their own will raise temperatures above raw. So again, people often say they're selling raw cacao or they're looking for raw cacao, and there's less clarity about what that actually means, particularly because those processes will already raise the temperature above general raw guidelines. And then when it comes to roasting, there's three important reasons that cacao is roasted. The first, and I think probably the most important I would consider, is for sanitary reasons. So the cacao has gone through a fermentation process. So if you imagine a large pile or box of cacao, tropical heat and humidity, the opportunity for harmful bacteria, pathogens, etc., to get in there is a real one, and roasting is a sanitizing procedure in that sense. The second one is that the flavor that we know of as chocolate is developed in the roasting process. There's something known as the Maillard reaction, and that happens above a certain temperature, and it changes the flavor profile of cacao. And the last reason is that for the winnowing to happen, the removal of the skin, it's a lot easier when it's roasted because it can just be blown off. So again, there's a long tradition of cacao being roasted. A lot of times raw cacao proponents talk about potential nutrient benefits of it being raw, which in a lot of cases is true. With cacao, there's not a lot of great studies that have compared the two side to side. Some studies cite higher ORAC value, which is a value used to determine the antioxidant content of a food. But at the same time, there's still not a lot understood about what kind of daily ORAC intake would be healthy for us, what different types of antioxidants we need and what they all do. There's a lot out there that's unknown in that department. So generally when I see people claiming to have raw cacao without a lot of real specific quality controls in the process, I'm doubtful if it actually is, and how they take care of the sanitary piece. And then lastly, cacao varieties. And this is a fun one for me because again, it highlights the complexity of cacao. And there's a website that I love, the cspot.com. It's there next to that quote, a great resource on all things cacao if you really want to do a deep dive into that world. So I'm just going to read this quote they have about cacao varieties because it sums it up pretty well. Practically every popular resource divides cacao into three primary varietals, Criollo, Forastero, and Trinitario, an overly simplistic and deeply flawed scheme, and by no means hard and fast distinctions because cacao is notoriously promiscuous, engendering classification nightmares and often plain guesswork. With so much genetic cross-pollination, hybridization, mutation, and recombination, it's rare and increasingly difficult to find any pure forms. So if you were to look up cacao varieties online, generally what you'll find is people define them in those three categories. Genetic scientists have, in the last 10 years or so, reclassified cacao into 11 primary strains. And so because cacao is promiscuous, it it cross-pollinates. You can find many different varieties on one tree. And so really for any claims that someone has a particular variety that they're selling, say Criollo or Arriba Nacional, to back that up would take continuous genetic testing at the source to verify that. So often, because of the nature of cacao, some of the varieties like Criollo, which is considered a heritage variety, which is more susceptible to disease, some of the hybridized varieties will often outcompete the other varieties, and so it's hard to find a lot of them. So a lot of times what's happening with claims of cacao variety is more marketing than reality. And I'll talk about a case of that as an example in a moment. And it's not because necessarily those varieties don't exist, but a lot of the more heritage varieties are really hard to find. It's hard to find an isolated source where it's guaranteed and the realities of whether or not they're being tested. So the two examples are both Criollo and Arriba Nacional. Arriba Nacional is not actually a variety. You'll see it on a lot of packaging that people have Arriba Nacional cacao from Ecuador. It's more of a colloquial term. Arriba in Spanish means up, as in upriver. So there's a geographic region within Ecuador. There is a variety known as Nacional. And about 10 years ago, some scientists were studying about 11,000 trees, I think it was, in Ecuador, and found maybe a half dozen that were pure forms of Nacional. So exceedingly rare, and Arriba Nacional usually is less a varietal reference and more just that it comes from this particular area of Ecuador. And then a little bit similarly with Criollo, again, people often claim to be selling Criollo cacao. Criollo is a specific variety. It's smaller seeded, and it's often highly sought after in the craft chocolate world. If you ever have the opportunity to find a genuine Criollo cacao bar or chocolate bar, highly recommend it. And the reason for that is because Criollo is lower in theobromine, which contributes to some of its bitter taste. So it packs all of the chocolate punch, less of the bitter, making it ideal for a chocolate bar. For ceremony purposes, it means less theobromine, less of that psychoactive component. Again, similar to Nacional, very, very rare to find a pure strain of it. So in closing, what I love about cacao is its complexity and that there's still so much that we're learning about it. It's like a rabbit hole, and every time I dive into it, I learn a whole lot more and realize how much is still to be learned about it, from its history, its makeup, its benefits, and it's a fascinating plant.